You're listening to Evil Podcast, a podcast where we explore stories of darkness and horror from the mind of Dennis Sarah. I am Dennis Sarah, and this is Evil. Evil Podcast is brought to you by Horror Pack, a monthly horror movie subscription pack. To find out more, go to evilpodcast.com and click on the Horror Pack button. You can also help support Evil Podcast by going to patreon.com/evilpodcast. As little as $1 can help us out. Father Colin was a pious man, a caring man, a good man, but a man nonetheless. Father Colin would spend his free time repairing homes for people who were incapable of paying for a contractor. When he was young, he would spend his summers working for his father. As a general contractor, Colin's father did all sorts of repairs for people. He learned how to put up drywall properly. He learned how to install a water heater and a sump pump. Through his father's guidance, he learned the value of a hard day's work. Father Colin didn't expect anything in return. He knew that sometimes people could use a helping hand, and he was happy to help. Sometimes even paying for a water heater out of his own pocket when he couldn't get one donated. The church members considered him a godsend and a kind man. As part of his duties, Father Colin was used to receiving confessions. It was in the confessional booth that he first heard that voice, that confession. The members of the church, for the most part, had typical sins: taking the Lord's name in vain, lust, petty theft, the occasional greed, small, absolvable sins. On what seemed a typical day, Father Colin just completed a confession of a teenage girl. She had stolen money from her mother's purse. The father assigned her a couple of Hail Marys and advised her to stop stealing, especially from a relative. She left the booth, and Father Colin thought, "See you again next week." With the departure of the teenage petty thief, the long line of confessions was coming close to an end. After her, a figure in a gray hoodie entered the booth. Father Colin started the ritual as was expected, but the hooded figure just sat silent. The figure sat back on the wooden bench, with his head down, and was not kneeling as was expected. Father Colin could hear the hooded figure breathe, as if he just sprinted to the booth from the parking lot. He leaned forward and looked at the hooded figure. Still nothing. He simply kept staring down towards his feet. The father lightly tapped on the screen and said, "You may begin." The head of the hooded figure tilted so his left eye could view Father Colin from the corner of his socket. Through the screen, Father Colin could feel his gaze. Those that normally entered the booth were either humble or bored. The difference was between those who were seeking true repentance and those who were just simply participating in a ritual. The hooded figure was neither humble nor bored. There was a genuine, careful malevolence about him, a darkness beneath his eyes. Father Colin shifted in his chair and stared a moment at the stranger. He finally said, "Do you need help, my son?" The rite of reconciliation usually begins on your knees with the sign of the cross and then stating, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned, my last confession was," and then you let me know when the last time you attended confession. "Can God forgive any sin, Father?" the stranger said as he continued to look at Father Colin from the corner of his eye. The father found himself going with a pat answer. "Place your trust in God, the merciful Father who wants to forgive you." He could tell the answer did not sit well with the stranger. "That was Father Brady's answer," the stranger said. "I need to know if what I've done is actually considered a sin, Father." Seeing a possible conclusion to the break-in ritual, Father Colin asked, "Did Father Brady take your confession, my son?" The stranger shifted again and lifted his head to face Father Colin. The hood hid most of his face in shadow. "He would not. He said I was not contrite. You see, Father, I'm not looking to make a confession. unless I have actually sinned. Father Colin maintained his rightful position and continued to look forward, avoiding eye contact. Tell me, what have you done, my son, and perhaps I can help alleviate your concern. The stranger leaned closer to the screen and quietly and unremarkably said, I have killed, Father. Father Colin reacted by meeting the stranger's gaze and searching his eyes for a recognition of the truth. The stranger's words were neither remorseful nor blissful. He said it as matter of fact as someone asking for the time. Father Colin was silent. He was not sure how to respond at first, but finally said, Thou shalt not kill is a commandment, my son, a sin in the eyes of the Lord. Have you killed a person? The stranger continued to stare through the screen. He digested the question for a bit before answering, Many, Father. I've killed many. Father Colin began to speak, but the stranger continued, I know it is a commandment, Father. But if it was God's will, then how could it be a sin? Are you saying God commanded you to kill my son? Father Colin said as he adjusted on the confessional seat. The stranger leaned back and looked back towards the ground. Not commanded directly, Father, no. No voices in my head, nothing like that. At first I felt guilty and I thought about seeking help. I turned to Bible study to seek answers. Things were confusing at first, but then I started to connect the dots. I learned we are all God's children, and nothing happens outside of God's plan. So the impulses, the rage I sometimes feel inside of me, surface only when God meant it to. Father Colin swallowed hard and thought deeply on how to respond. My son, theologians have theorized and researched for centuries on the gift of free will, how we determine our own path. The stranger lashed out with his fist and struck the confessional screen. Father Colin jumped at the sudden act of violence. The stranger had followed up the strike by pressing his face on the screen. His face was twisted and distorted against the strained barrier. Father Colin leaned away to create some distance between him and the angry stranger. The simple screen strained and creaked under the pressure of his face. Who are you to question God's will? The stranger said through his teeth. As Father Colin retreated to the back corner of the confessional booth, the stranger stormed out of the booth and slammed the door behind him. The father gathered himself and opened the confessional door. The few remaining parishioners were wide-eyed and staring at the stranger who had just pushed his way through them and exited the church through the main doors. Father Colin calmed the parishioners with a smile and a nod. With barely a word, he indicated the rite of reconciliation would continue, and they can return to the confessional. As the father re-entered the booth, he paused and glanced back towards the main church doors. A slight frown appeared on his face. Days passed as they do, and Father Colin did not hear from the stranger. He had almost forgot their meeting in the confessional. Almost. Father Colin slept. He did not notice the occasional flashing blue and red lights that passed by his bedroom window. He slept peacefully and without concern. Father Colin failed to notice the flashing lights, and he also failed to notice the figure sitting in the chair next to his bed. Father had that feeling you get when you know something is off. As he slept, he heard something, a clicking sound that was out of place. Father Colin flitted his eyes open as another group of flashing blue and red lights passed by. The illumination of the flashing lights briefly crossed the figure sitting in the room. The father sprang up in a sitting position. Good evening, Father, a familiar voice said. Sorry for the late night visit, but I did not get an answer to my original question. Father Colin rubbed his eyes quickly as not to obscure his vision for too long, but an attempt to focus better on the unwelcome visitor. Your original question? Father Colin asked, but as soon as he did, he realized who the voice belonged to. It was the angry stranger from the confessional booth. He appeared to be in the same gray hoodie. The stranger was playing with rosary beads in his left hand. Father Colin surmised the beads were the source of the clicking that had awoke him. However, The father noticed the flashing lights from outside glinting off a revolver in the stranger's right hand. He tried to act calm and said, "Perhaps it would be better if we met tomorrow in my office to discuss your question." The stranger glanced towards the window as another show of flashing blue and red lights drove by, and said, "I'm afraid I will need an answer tonight." Father Colin glanced through the window and back to the stranger. His mind raced as he was trying to grasp what the stranger was saying. Without thinking, he reached for the lamp on his nightstand and clicked it on. The startled stranger tensed, raised the revolver, and pointed it at the priest. Father Colin quickly brought up his hands, palms out, and without a word pleaded to the stranger not to shoot. For a moment, both were frozen, wondering what the other was thinking. Finally, Father Colin spoke. "Your question, it was about knowing if you have sinned, yes?" The stranger lowered his revolver. "Yes, it was. Do you have an answer?" The stranger rose from the chair and stepped towards the bed. It now registered with Father Colin that the stranger was covered with numerous blood spots, as if someone had thrown a raw steak into a fan while the stranger was standing in front of it. However, the rosary beads he still had in his left hand were covered in blood. The blood had started to congeal and formed a red sticky paste on the beads in the stranger's left hand. Father Colin cautiously lowered his hands and pointed towards the rosary beads. "Whose blood is that, my son?" The stranger instinctively pulled his left hand behind his back, like a kid trying to hide a piece of candy he stole. However, he immediately returned his hand to the front. The stranger simply said, "I believe it was God's will." Despite the blood covering them, Father Colin thought he recognized the rosary beads. He believed they had belonged to Father Brady. If that was Father Brady's blood, did that mean he was next? The stranger's eyes still held his question. "Do you have an answer?" I still believe we have free will, my son," Father Colin stammered. The stranger's face began to distort with anger. His grip on the pistol tightened. Father Colin, sensing the stranger's anger, stepped off the bed towards him. His palms were out while trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. Just as Father Colin was about to speak, there came a loud knocking on the apartment door. Both men froze. The knocking continued and was followed by, "This is the police. Open the door." The stranger stepped out of the bedroom into the living room. Father Colin followed him, trying to find the words that would convince the stranger to give up peacefully. They were halfway through the living room when another, more aggressive knock came at the door. The stranger stopped, raised the revolver at the door, and cocked the gun. Without thinking, Father Colin leapt at the outstretched arm of the stranger and grabbed him by the wrist, forcing the stranger's arm upwards, and the resulting shot went high through the door. Father Colin and the stranger wrestled for the gun. After a few moments, the police on the other side of the door must have heard the struggle, as the aggressive knocks turned into heavy kicks. The door quickly began to weaken under the heavy foot of the officer outside. Father Colin held his own, as his volunteer work of manual labor kept him in shape. The rage of the stranger was difficult to fight. The two rolled around the living room, knocking over furniture. Father Colin desperately held onto the stranger's wrist, trying to force the gun from his hand. As the door gave way, the two fell back over the couch. They landed on the floor and a shot came from the gun. The police officer ran over to the two. Both were laying still as the struggle ceased with the shot. Father Colin rolled up the stranger only to see the stranger's gray hoodie with a growing bloodstain in the middle. The father placed the gun on the floor away from the two and leaned over the stranger. The stranger looked up at him and said through bloodstained teeth, "Don't worry, it was God's will." That was another original story by me. Funny thing is if when you write, a lot of times I'm just going off an image or a thought or a plot device, I guess, and then letting the story kind of write out itself. So when I started this, all I thought about was I want a scene where a stranger is in a man's bedroom and he's not supposed to be there. And then the rest of it kind of fell into place. I don't know if any of you out there write at all, but you could probably attest to this, that sometimes the story just does not go where you thought it was going to go. And in this case, it was true. I'd say I have no idea a week ago that how the story would turn out. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to hear more of the stories, go to evilpodcast.com. Our archives are there. Evil Podcast can be found on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, and anywhere you can really find any of your podcasts. A great way to support Evil Podcast is by hitting subscribe on whatever podcast player you're using. As well, you can rate and review us. And speaking of reviews, I'd like to thank Phoebe B. from Australia for their 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. I'd also like to thank Madness Pod for their 5-star review. Now, I know Madness Pod is from Minds of Madness podcast. If you get a chance, please check them out. As this podcast grows in popularity, I'd like to thank both Minds of Madness and Pleasing Terrors. They allowed me to do a guest intro on their podcast. As soon as that happened, a number of people came over to listen to me. Thank to both of you for that. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to support Evil Podcast, please go to patreon.com/evilpodcast. Becoming a patron means you allowing me to continue on with Evil Podcast and keep the lights on here. There is a little bit of expense that goes along with podcasting, between equipment and web storage. To offset that cost, we have Patreons that donate as little as $1 a month. And believe me, even that is greatly appreciated. With that said, I'd like to thank our newest Patreon, Terry Griffin. Much appreciated. Thank you for the support. If you'd like to contact me, you can go to evilpodcast.com. Or, if you are on Twitter, you can reach me at Dennis Sarah. Again, I'd like to thank you for listening and tuning in. Until next episode, be good.